Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us once again for this webinar from Risk-Based Security. It's great to have you here, and I hope you are doing really well. So my name is Brendan Dodds. I'm a director here at Risk-Based Security, and I have the privilege of being your host for today. Over the next 20-30 minutes, we'll be digging into the latest statistics on the data breach landscape based on updated data through Q4 2020. We'll be seeing who has been targeted and how, and we'll also be looking at some of the recent trends we're seeing, including digging a little bit deeper into one particular bad actor who has made quite a splash this year. So before we get into the data and the charts, just a few quick points of housekeeping so you get the most out of today's session. We are recording this session, so you will be able to check that out on our website after the session is concluded, and I will share a link to that shortly. But first, I do want you to know that this analysis is based on our year-end 2020 data breach QuickView report. We put these out every quarter, and at the end of the year, we take all of the data and all of our observations, we package it up. It's a very powerful and useful document packed with actionable insights, so please check that out. It's available to you at no cost to download. You can grab it right here in BrightTalk. You'll also be able to find it on our website. And if you're watching this video in replay form, we'll make sure we add a link to that as well at the bottom. Please, if you are ever stuck to find things, get in touch or look us up on our website, riskbasedsecurity.com. So as I said, we are recording the session today. Do share the link with your colleagues and anyone else who might find it useful or interesting. And this is part of an ongoing series of webinars really focusing on the latest trends and issues in data breaches and vulnerabilities. So take a look at our BrightTalk channel. You'll see what else is on offer. And you can also scroll through some of the sessions and check out our vulnerability QuickView session, which will be coming up soon. We do like to hear from you, so please do share your questions. There's a box provided right here on BrightTalk. It doesn't include your name. You are anonymous by default, but if you want us to know who you are and acknowledge you as the author of the question, please just mention your name in the question itself. We will pick up any questions as we go that seem particularly relevant, but we're also going to try and pause at the end and make sure we have some discussion and pick up any of the topics that you want to hear more about at that time. And if you are watching the replay and you need to get in touch with us for any other reason, you can always do that via the contact page on our website, which again is riskbasedsecurity.com. Well, as I said before, my name is Brendan Dodds, but it is time to introduce you to our presenter for today's session. Inga Godin is our Executive Vice President here at Risk-Based Security. She found her way to information security after 20 years in the insurance industry, where she got to see firsthand the impact of ineffective security program management. And of course, the financial fallout from those data breach events that we're covering today. Well, here at Risk-Based Security, she's responsible for our cyber risk analytics and your CISO products and our industry-leading data breach research team. So it's my pleasure to hand you over to Inga, who's going to take us through today's agenda.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you everyone for joining us, for tuning in today. My name is Inga, as Brendan said, and I'm really excited to be your host today for our session as we talk about all of the findings in our 2020 year-end data breach report. For those of you who have joined in to our sessions in the past, I think our agenda is going to look fairly familiar, but we have added a couple of things, changed up a couple of things, because it has been a truly weird year. So we thought it would be a good time to take a step back and actually start our session this morning with some high-level observations, just our thoughts on what we're seeing through our lens of breach research on what has been truly a wild and crazy year. From there, we are, of course, going to turn our attention to all of the breach numbers, where we will be digging in to who, what, where, when, and how all of this activity took place over the year. And then we want to round out our session today by taking a quick minute to bring all these threads together and share our observations for what we think this is going to mean going into 2021. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. With my moment of indulgence here, just to share some of my observations on the year. And I think, like most of you, it is a huge relief to me to see the sun set on 2020. I know the word unprecedented has been thrown around way too much this year. That, along with a year unlike any other, are probably two things that should really be retired from our vocabulary. But I think no matter how you slice it or how you look at it, or what your lens is into the data security realm, 2020 really has been an extraordinary year. It's been truly unique. So with that, I just wanted to share some of my observations, and top among them is I do think that our security teams really do deserve a big pat on the back for how they performed in 2020. If you have restrictions lifted and you can take your IT folks and your security teams out for a beer, please do so. They have definitely earned it this past year. Because if you do take a step back and think about it, back in March, over a period of just a few weeks, entire workforces around the globe shifted from being a centralized workforces going into offices with working remote as sort of a one-off sort of thing to all of a sudden all this working, all this learning, and all this activity suddenly taking place remotely, distributed all over the place. And if you're in an organization and you're thinking about undertaking a project like that, that's something that you would probably plan and execute over months, if not more than a year, to implement something like that. And yet our IT and our security teams were able to pivot and stand up new working environments over the course of just a few weeks. And they did that without any massive spike in data breaches. In fact, quite the opposite, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a minute, or any widespread or systemic security failures. I mean, yes, we did have Zoom bombing, but we got over that, and there were some capacity challenges in there as well. But for the most part, security teams and IT teams performed extraordinarily well, and they all do deserve a moment of congratulation for what was a really difficult year for them. So hats off to you guys. A second observation that really 2020 really brought home to me is that malicious actors, by and large, behave how they always behave. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, yes, malicious actors were out there. They were ready to take advantage of the crisis. I think they really do live by the motto, never let a good crisis go to waste. And we saw that unfold through 2020 as well. You know, there were plenty of COVID-related phishing scams, schemings going on out there, unemployment or welfare payment programs, support programs were massively attacked by identity thieves, or identity thieves using that data to fraudulently cheat those programs. And yes, we did see all of that. But how those campaigns were executed and the methods and the techniques used behind those campaigns were very much similar. It was just cover for a new type of cover, a new opportunity, and attackers always looking for a new opportunity took advantage. So in that sense, they behaved how they always do. And likewise, or even more fundamentally, they behave like how most businesses behave. They decided to focus on those types of attacks that they were going to be able to get the biggest bang for their buck. And in 2020, the story there is really all about ransomware, and really that act of leveraging the data extraction, along with encryption extortion schemes. Say that 5 times fast. But it's really that really was the story for 2020. But despite that, the pandemic and all of the changes that we went through, I don't think they really impacted attackers pivoting to ransomware. In fact, I think the groundwork for these types of attacks was really set up and laid down late in 2019. So regardless of what had happened in the year, we were going to see that pivot to those ransomware type of attacks, no matter what, because attackers do what attackers always do, and they follow the path that's going to make the most return for them. And we'll discuss those impacts as we go through our session today. And then my third observation, my final observation I want to share real quickly is just some of our own reporting challenges, along with a quick reminder that what we're looking at today are publicly disclosed breach events. And like everyone else, with so much attention and so much news being focused on other issues, and rightly so, the amount of information coming to light about data breaches or data compromise events took a bit of a hit. Along with that, governmental agencies and reporting agencies that promote or share information about breaches, they faced their own challenges that resulted in a bit of a slowdown of information coming out. And we also saw fewer database packs or collections of data being leaked in 2020. And all of these forces, all of those reporting and delay type of forces, they came together to impact our numbers. And how did they impact our numbers? Well, you can see right there on the first chart of the day that we did see quite a decline in publicly disclosed breaches in 2020. In fact, we came in at 3,932 events, which is a 48% decline compared to the number of publicly disclosed breaches in 2019. And you can see from the chart that's down to its lowest point since 2014. But again, there's more to the story than that decline in than just that 48% drop. And I think the focus here is really that we had just less collections coming out, we had less news coming out, and a bit slower reporting. Now, I will say sources have always, throughout the year, have been catching up. Slowly but surely. And at the time that we produced this report, we were looking at numbers as of January 4th. Since that time, the numbers have continued to develop. We are up and over 4,000 publicly disclosed breach events now for 2020, and we think those numbers are going to continue to develop as information trickles out on the year. So my instinct is that we're going to end up more along the lines of 2015, 2016 in that 41 to 4,300 range. Now, if we flip the lens and look at the number of records exposed, it is actually the polar opposite. So even though the number of breaches disclosed came down this year, the number of records exposed absolutely exploded and came in at 37.1 billion, and yes, that is billion with a B, sensitive records exposed in the year. And that is more than double what we saw in 2019, and by far the largest number of records exposed that we have seen really since tracking data breach events. By a percentage, it's a 141% increase compared to 2019. Now, again, there's always more to the story behind these numbers, and there were 5 events in particular that really did impact 2020. In fact, 5 of the largest events of 2020 accounted for 82% of those records exposed. So, had some real whoppers this year, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as well. So as we move ahead, the next lens or the next way that we like to look at the numbers is by looking at how did data breaches happen. And for regular listeners, I don't think we're going to see a big surprise here in the trends, because for a very long time now, for at least the past 4 years, and I think going on 5 years now, we've seen unauthorized access into systems or services, shorthand or coded as hacking here on the chart, as being the leading breach type, accounting for the most number of publicly disclosed breach events. When we are talking about number of records exposed, inadvertently, usually inadvertently, making information available on the web, also known, or making that information available online, which is coded as web, accounted for the most number of records exposed at 35 billion. Now, I did want to mention, I know we talked a little bit about ransomware at the opening of our session. We do consider most of ransomware events these days to also be data compromise events. A lot of these get coded as hacking because attackers are into the system now first, poking around, seeing what they can find, either accessing sensitive data or outright stealing sensitive data before launching the encryption malware. So we are capturing those, and I did want to share that we saw a 100% increase in the number of data compromise events that included ransomware as an element of the attack. So a 100% increase in 2020. And I did want to mention that and call that out because as you look around, you'll see a lot of research about the big increases in ransomware out there. And our reports, our data reinforces those findings. Now, everyone can have a slightly different percentage depending on exactly what they're looking at there, or what they're comparing. But just know that it's not smoke. it's not FUD. Ransomware really has been the name of the game in 2020. What I did think was another interesting aspect of these particular two charts is over there on the number of records exposed, where we see both snail mail, which is accidentally putting sensitive information into the wrong letter and sending it off to the wrong folks, along with disposal of computer or electronic computer equipment. Now, it has been a long time since we've seen those two particular breach types break into the top 5 for exposing for number of records exposed, and the two together accounted for over 52 million records exposed in 2020. Now, personally, my gut tells me that this is going to be an effect of the year of how 2020 has unfolded, because typically things like retiring old computer equipment, those are, and putting letters in the mail, those things are typically fairly well-controlled processes. But with all the disruptions that we've seen at businesses over the years, or excuse me, over this past year, I think that that just not being physically present, not being there to see that equipment get on the truck, or spot check letters that are going out, or make sure that merge file is done correctly. I think not being present for some of these processes has led to those sort of old school breach types starting to make an appearance in 2020. And it'll be interesting to see if they show up again in 2021. I'm going to bet no. Another lens that we like to use to look at the breaches for the year is impact on confidentiality. Now, if you're thinking, oh, well, it's a breach, obviously data has been exposed, but not all breaches are created equal. And there are certainly events where attackers could have accessed the information, or perhaps the information was sitting on those computers that were being disposed of, and you're not sure if somebody actually accessed it or not, but the organization has lost control of them. That's a potential exposure. The organization's lost control over the information, but there's no confirmation that it's been used it's in the hands of others who shouldn't have it, opposed to confirmed exposure, which is going to be something like, hey, your credit cards are showing up on Joker Stash, or something along those lines. And this is another area where I think we're seeing some of a ransomware effect start to come out again in the year. In the past, usually the percentage of breaches where the data is confirmed to be exposed is in that 80 to 85% range. Whereas in 2020, you can see from the pie chart that that's not quite 85% on that confirmed. And in fact, it dropped down to 62% confirmed. And why do I think this is a ransomware effect? Because what we're seeing is we're capturing information. We know an organization's been popped. We know attackers were in the system. So it starts out as being a potential in our schema. And then 4, 6, sometimes 8, 9, 10 months down the road, we start to see new information coming out saying, yes, this data was actually stolen, moving it into confirmed. So I think this percentage is actually going to change as more information comes out. Will it get up to the 80%? I'm thinking probably not, but this is an area where we think that pivot to more ransomware extortion type schemes is having an impact in the statistics that we're seeing. Another trend, another sad trend worth talking about in 2020 is breach severity. Now, all of the data exposure, data compromise events that we track in our system gets assigned a severity score. It's on a scale from 1 to 10, and it is determined by a number of factors, and it changes over time. So we look at things like number of records exposed, type of data exposed, how it was compromised, and then certain follow-on events, like was there a lawsuit? Were there impacted third parties or customers, business customers that were impacted by the event? All these things come together to form a severity score. And what we have seen since the beginning of the year is a steady increase in average severity. We started out 2020 in the neighborhood of about 4.4 as an average severity score for the first quarter. That ticked up in Q2. Q2 came in, I think, in the low 5 range. That ticked up again in Q3. Q3 bucked the trend a little bit. Q3 average severity score was 5.56 when we did our Q3 report. It actually came down. It's the only quarter so far this year that's come down to 5.53. So that's a good sign. But then again, the Q4 average severity came in at 5.71, the highest average severity that we've seen all year. So breaches, even though there's some caveats around like that total number of records exposed, there were some monster breaches in there that accounted for some of that. On the whole, looking across the full spectrum of events that we track this year, we do see severity increasing from quarter to quarter. Now, with that, we did want to take a moment to talk about what sort of information was compromised. And this is another spot where we're going to talk a little bit about the ransomware effect as well. And what you can see in this past year, the two most targeted data types, or the data types most exposed, were individuals' names and their email addresses. But what I do want to draw everybody's attention to is that third bar on the line, that unknown bar coming in at almost 30%. And this, again, is, I think, a pivot, or the effect of the pivot to different types of attacks in 2020. Because 30% for an unknown data type appearing in our associated with a breach is pretty high, especially compared to prior years, which you can see in the chart, or the table on the right. In prior years, in 2019 and 2018, the number of breaches, or the percentage of breaches that included an unknown data type, were down around 10, 12, 13%. It jumped to 30% in 2020. Again, thanks in large part to knowing that attackers were in there, but not knowing exactly what they might have been able to access, or the companies or the organizations that were compromised themselves not necessarily coming out with a whole lot of detail about what sort of information was compromised. Another change that I think might catch folks' attention is if you look at access credentials here with username and email address combinations. And again, if you look at that table on the right, you can see that in the past couple of years that those numbers were pretty high. The access credentials were exposed in anywhere from 50 to 60% of the data breaches that we were tracking. Now, a part of that was due, again, to some of those large collections that came out in prior years, that we didn't see that type of activity happening again in 2020. But that's not to say that this type of information isn't still incredibly valuable to attackers. And to that point, or to that end, I did want to highlight some research, some great research that our team has done on one particular threat actor that goes by the moniker Shiny Hunters. There's a great write-up in the year-end data breach report. There's also a blog post on the risk-based security website digging into what this particular threat group has done. And just to illustrate how much of this data really is out there right now, we monitored their activity over a period of 5 weeks, from the end of October, or excuse me, from the beginning of October through the first part of November. And over that course of 5 weeks, this particular threat actor leaked 17 individual databases. And of those 17 databases in total, they exposed at least 129 million access credentials. And this data was quite popular. Folks were picking it up all over the all over the place. And in total, the Shiny Hunters person group, threat actor, I think is the right way to describe them. Over the course of 2020, this particular group person had 47 total data dumps, exposing over 550 million users' credentials. So just because those percentages might look a little bit lower in that previous slide, please don't take that to mean that access credentials are somehow less actively pursued or traded out there, because they most certainly do remain vital information for attackers as a part of their attack sequence. And we have seen things like credential stuffing attacks continue throughout the year and even into 2021. So always more stories behind the numbers, right? Moving on from there, it's good to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about who was breached in 2020. And unfortunately, kind of hurts my heart a little bit. We did see the healthcare economic sector come in as the most, as the sector reporting the most breaches. They were followed closely by the information sector, which largely is made up of software developers and online services, hosting services, that sort of thing. Contrast that with the healthcare sector. We actually saw really no element of the healthcare sector was immune from data exposure events throughout the year. Hospitals, healthcare systems, individual provider offices, allied health facilities like X-ray facility or radiology facilities, that sort of thing, they all experienced attacks on a fairly equal basis. What is a little bit interesting or unusual here on this slide is you see manufacturing start to creep up. Now, usually manufacturing is relatively low. Usually we see that is being down towards the bottom of the list, not necessarily targeted on a frequent basis. But what we're starting to see, especially through like the last few months of 2020, is manufacturing on a slow and steady march up as being a more targeted type of industry. Now, why is an excellent question, and I do think again we're starting to see some of the ramifications of those of threat actors pivoting to those extraction and extortion schemes, especially if they're able to get that malware into the operations side, the actual factory processing side of the business. Those systems, the SCADA systems, the PLCs, what have you, they are very vulnerable. If attackers can knock those out, it can cause significant economic pain for that target, which just further leverages or ratchets up the pressure for those organizations to pay. And I think what we're starting to see is a little more interest in manufacturers, because there is such a terrible downside for those companies for extended amounts of downtime. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues into 2021. It is one of the trends that we're watching very closely. Going on from there, we did want to take a little bit of time to focus on third-party breaches, something that we do from time to time in our reports, and we wanted to include it in this year as well. So what do we mean by third-party breaches? For us, it could be synonymous with a supply chain attack, but it is also for our schema. For us, it is it's those situations where an organization is holding or processing information on behalf of their other business customers. So it's a B2B type of relationship, and for reasons that happen that particular organization is popped, and the data that is compromised is not only their own data, but also the data that belongs to their business customers. And what we saw in 2020 was a slight decline in the number of those breaches that impacted third parties. It dropped to 319 from 395. Which is a decline for sure, but it is not nearly as big as the decline that we saw for breach activity as a total. Not a big 48%, 50% drop here. No, these are still fairly useful targets for attackers. So even though we are seeing that decline, we think that's a decline again in just that information coming out, as opposed to these being less interesting targets. We do also look at the number of records exposed at these particular events. Because we are looking at a relatively small data set, we are talking about 319, 395 breaches over the last couple of years, and we do see larger swings in the number of records exposed. 2019, we were looking at 4.7 billion records exposed at these third-party breaches. There was one particularly large event in there that drove that experience. In 2020, we saw 2.4 billion records exposed across these events, which again, just a handful of breaches in there, one in particular, I would say, really accounted for about half of those records exposed. So still interesting and useful to look at, but just keep in mind that there can be some bigger swings or bigger movement that is influenced just by the lower number of breaches that we're taking a look at in that particular section. When we are talking about third-party breaches, they can be incredibly painful and incredibly damaging, not only for the organization itself that is breached, but for their business customers who've had their customer data exposed as well. And in 2020, we did see probably one of the most I don't know if egregious is quite the right word, but one of the an example of a third-party breach that is going to be with us, that's going to stick with us on the research team certainly for a very long time. And that is the events that unfolded at the software service provider Blackbaud. And if you haven't heard of Blackbaud, they're a fairly large company. They are a publicly traded company with a very prominent in the nonprofit sector, because they provide donor management, donor software for donor management. And they have anywhere from 30,000 to 40,000 customers worldwide, depending on which information you look at. But no matter how you slice it, a very sizable company with a very broad reach. They were targeted by a ransomware attack in this past summer. And initially the news was pretty good about this event. They were able to stop the encryption very early before it did any sort of extensive damage across the Blackbaud system, which was great news. But unfortunately, attackers were in there, and they were able to exfiltrate information that belonged to their customers. And that's when things started to get kind of hinky here. There are hundreds and possibly even thousands of their customers' donor data that has been exposed. We know it is most likely, we know it is more than 10 million records that have been compromised. The total number of records compromised is still unknown, because each of their customers is reporting individually. So some customers are disclosing how many records they were lost or are put at risk. Other customers are not. So the overall size in terms of the number of records compromised in this particular event is obscured by the number of organizations that have been impacted by the event as well. One thing that has been interesting to us is to watch the notification process unfold here. And typically when we have these breaches, these third-party breaches, one of the things that we keenly want to observe is how closely does that organization work with and communicate with their business customers that were also impacted by this event. And it's been a challenge to watch this unfold for Blackbaud. Clients themselves seem to be tasked, each nonprofit seems to be tasked with managing their own notification process. Whether or not they've been impacted has been slow to come to light. And even though this event happened back in July, all the way through to this week, we are still seeing notification letters come out from nonprofits around the country and really around the world who had donor data impacted here. So spiraling event, I think, by any measure on that front. We have also seen a lot of legal activity around this particular event. Not only lawsuits targeting Blackbaud in particular, but now lawsuits starting to be filed against their customers for a failure to adequately monitor or verify the security of their vendor. So all in all, it is a case study, I think, in what can go wrong for the customer when there is this third-party type of breach. So something of interest certainly for this year, and something worth watching as time goes on to understand how some of those breaches at third parties can have the spiraling and unfolding effect on their customers. So with that, we did want to, with that sad piece of news, we did want to pivot a little bit, of course, to spend a few minutes talking about where did breaches occur in 2020. We always want to include some geographic information in our reports, and did want to touch on it here in our session today as well. And fairly typical, we did see over 2,300 breach events that we catalog for our report being disclosed here in the US, with the balance being split outside of the US and into unknown as well, or unknown locations where either the organization couldn't definitively be identified, or where it took place couldn't definitively be identified. Now we do have these conversation always about, well, because the United States makes a bit more information publicly available about data compromise events, that's what influences the numbers, and that there's not really more breaches taking place in the US. And I understand that that reaction, or that thought, that point of view, and I can't discount it completely. But at the same token, if you think about it, I think more than 30% of the world's Fortune 2000 largest organizations are headquartered in the United States. Upwards of 30 some odd percent of the world's wealth is located in the United States. And I think the vast majority of businesses, there's just a lot of business activity taking place in the United States. So if you're an attacker, if you're looking for the juiciest targets for big attack surface and deep pockets that might be able to pay, the US provides fertile hunting ground. So a little bit of a chicken and egg question, but I do think there is some truth to just more breach activity taking place in the States. So with that, as we're starting to round out our time together today, did want to take a quick moment to tie all of these threads together and talk a little bit about how we see these unfolding or playing out into 2021, our new year. First and foremost, since ransomware and those extortion schemes were so popular in 2020, yes, we do expect to see those extortion and encryption schemes continuing into 2021. But at the same time, we are starting to see more actions, or more action being taken to try to combat the effectiveness of these attacks. And just as a reminder, back in October, we saw the Treasury Department come out with some fairly strong words around potential sanctions for organizations that do pay some of these extortion demands. If that money is going to a group that might be on the OFAC list, that can lead to a sanction from the Treasury Department. And they actually had they actually had strong words specifically targeted at the insurance industry and the IT industry as well, saying that even facilitating these types of payments can get you into sanctions hot water. So, it doesn't have to be you transferring the Bitcoin. If you help another organization transfer that Bitcoin, you too can be at risk for being sanctioned by the Treasury Department. And those were some pretty strong words, I thought, that they put out there in October. Following that, just this past week, we did see some new advisory committees coming together, looking to put together some frameworks to help fight these particular type of attacks in order to put together some more actionable objectives that can be specifically directed towards curbing these types of attacks. So we're looking forward to seeing what some of those actions are that come out of those groups. And likewise, we're starting to hear more voices speak out against paying these ransom demands. And I think all of us are very sympathetic to the organizations that find themselves potentially facing an existential threat. All of their data might be gone. Their operations might be frozen. It could be we either pay or we go out of business. And that is a horrible position to be put in. And I think everybody in the security community is sympathetic to that, to being stuck in that rock and a hard place. But there is no denying the fact that the more the ransom is paid, the more times those ransoms are paid, the more it fuels the attack on the next guy down the road. And we are starting to hear, I think, more and more voices coming out and being very strong about how paying these ransom demands only emboldens and furthers additional attacks. So that's going to be, I think, interesting to watch how that conversation unfolds in this year. I do think supply chain attacks are going to continue to be a serious problem. Even events like those at Blackbaud, they're bad enough, but when we add in events like what we saw at SolarWinds, where attackers were actually able to poison the code and install backdoors into thousands of their customers, I think that we're going to see some more audacious attacks along those lines. And in fact, we've already seen a couple of those come out so far in 2021. So buckle in. I think it's not a good sign of things to come. And then, of course, I did want to mention real quickly our our threat actor group, Shiny Hunters, did return just this past last week with another round of data leaks from 10 different organizations being shared online, which was kind of funny because when we wrote up our observations of what they had done through the 2020, we made the observation, I wonder what other data sets they might be sitting on. Only time will tell. Well, we didn't have to wait very long to find out what those additional data sets were. So we do expect to see, again, those leak credentials continue to be actively traded and pursued in the deeper and darker corners of the web. So with that, as we're coming to the end of our time today, I did just want to recap a couple of our findings. Did want to bring home the point once again that even though the number of publicly disclosed breaches is down so far for 2020, please do not take that away to mean that there's been actually less breach activity. There have been additional forces at work, whether it is threat actors sitting on data, not sharing as much data, news being slow to come out, reports being slow to be promoted, that sort of thing. We do think breach activity is continuing, and those numbers are somewhat suppressed by the activity, by the circumstances of 2020. Other thoughts on closing, certainly do have those conversations ahead of time about do we want to pay those ransom demands or not. I think that is an important conversation to be having as we go into the new year, because ransomware I don't think is going to go anywhere in 2021, and it is going to require collective action to be able to take a bite out of those. So with all of that said, just a quick reminder that all of this data is a product of Cyber Risk Analytics, the standard for actionable data breach intelligence, risk ratings, and supply chain monitoring. If you're interested in the service at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd be happy to show you around the site, get deeper into the weeds of our data. There is a lot more information within Cyber Risk Analytics than we're able to include in our report, so we'd be happy to share all of that with you. So with that, I don't think we have any questions coming in from the audience, but if you do have questions, please, please, please do reach out to us. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed having you here today, and we look forward to seeing you in our next presentation. Thank you.